And so we're talking now about what's defined as the first order reality and the second order reality. So the first order reality are the physically observable qualities, things, experiences, or situations that arise. It's sort of just the matter of fact, I'm feeling, cold on my arm because there's an ice cube there. Like, we can't really debate the fact that there's this sensation that I will then interpret as being cold, but the sensation itself is part of the first order reality. And so this is what we know as the direct experience of the moment. The first order reality generally cannot be debated. In tantric terms, it's really just the pure experience of what's happening before our mind starts to tell us the story about it. And then the second order reality involves attaching meaning through the organization and interpretation processes to the things, the situations, or the experiences that we're talking about. So in other words, the second order of reality is the mind interpreting the experiences, the events, and the situations, and it tells a story to us about what's happening. So if we start to look at an example here, we can imagine that maybe ourselves or somebody else is in a restaurant, and there is a group of people that is near our table, and suddenly there's someone at that table that starts to laugh very loudly. So the first order of reality is that we hear or we see someone laughing. We know for sure that there's this person over there laughing. But based upon our organization of what that might mean, based upon the mindset that we're in at that time, our own karmic patterns, how we interpret that laughter might be, something that could be very unique or personal. And in many cases might have nothing to do with what the other person is actually doing or thinking or feeling. So it's possible, for instance, that we feel some joy out of it, that we sort of enjoy the laughter and we feel kind of inspired by it. Someone's having fun. Or we might actually feel some discomfort. So the reaction and the feelings are going to arise as a sensation in our body. So someone laughs, we have a reaction to it. It might be joyful, it might be discomfort. So at that level, what we're actually feeling, just like the sensation of the ice cube, the sensation of what our reaction is part of the first order of reality. It is the actual experience that's arising. And so what we feel at that level of first order reality, it could be butterflies in the stomach, it could be a lightness in the body. If we're thinking of sort of an expansion into joy, there might be tightness in the belly or the chest. And so those become the first order experiences. So this is the actual experience of what happens in the moment. And then the second order reality is when we start to organize that and interpret it. So perhaps the tightness and discomfort starts to arise in us as someone laughs, and we recognize and start to tell a story of thinking maybe they're laughing at us, and that an insecurity experience kind of arises, that maybe they're laughing at us. Or perhaps we think this person might be really drunk and they're obnoxious. That becomes our interpretation for it. They're just being really loud and obnoxious, and that's going to be the interpretation. Or perhaps it makes us feel joyful and we think, wow, that person's having so much fun. So, but without the person telling us what their actual experience is, what their reason for laughing is, anything that we decide is ultimately speculation. If we're deciding what they're doing, why they're laughing, we can come up with our story about how they might be laughing at us, but it potentially has no bearing on the actual circumstances of what's happening. So that's just a short, simple example of one way that it might unfold. And so in terms of now looking at that process of the selection, of the organization, and the interpretation, this happens pretty much in everything, whether it's dealing with other people, whether it's situations where we're by ourselves in nature, we're still kind of selecting and interpreting the experiences we're having. And it also happens internally. We are passing judgments on ourselves and giving ourselves praise or criticism or whatever may happen in the various different stories that we have. And again, all based upon past conditioning and karmic patterning. And so part of the importance of this teaching and bringing this into awareness, as I talked about in one of the recent classes, the power of awareness is actually one of the things that is designed in this process to actually start to free us. And inviting just a curiosity about things that we haven't normally paid attention to becomes one of the first and most powerful steps. And so we can bring attention and awareness and the power of our awareness actually to the first order of reality experiences, the sensations in the body, for instance, the vibrations that are happening in our experience. And we can also begin to bring our awareness to start investigating this process of perception that I just described to you. Because again, most people just sort of take the experience of life as it is. But this is actually one of those things which, as many things in Tantra are pointing to this, that part of the tantric principle is that unless it's your direct experience, it isn't actually true. So there are lots of truths according to the tradition that are pointed to, but the important part of all of it is that you learn to have the direct experience instead of just blindly sort of, coming along with, blind faith of believing something that you don't necessarily have the experience or, direct experience of. And so, yes, the teachings are to point us to the things that we can investigate with the hopes that we'll have the direct experience. It can be helpful to explore those ideas with curiosity, but we don't want to take it up as blind, just intellectual knowledge without also investigating the experience. And so the experience of our powers of perception is something that if you stop and pay attention, you can recognize all of the things, you can observe all of the things I talked about. The something coming in, the reference in the organization of past experiences, and then the story that starts to arise. You'll be able to see that happening within your own direct experience. And what happens in this process, especially when we are not bringing awareness to what's actually happening, is that most people will mistake the second order reality or their own interpretation for reality and the truth. And that becomes the interpretation, is the story and the interpretation that I have brought into awareness based upon my past conditioning and my past karmic patterns. I will decide in that moment, if I am mistaken, that my interpretation is the absolute truth. There's no arguing with it. And this can get us into a lot of troubles. Now, of course, we're all intelligent beings, and there are times that our interpretation is very much accurate to what someone else might be feeling or, those experiences. And so we're not saying that we're always going to be wrong, but we want to start to be able to observe the process and learn when and how and if it's helpful. And ultimately, the invitation in Tantra is to start dropping our awareness below the story itself and start coming into the direct experience of that first order of reality, of the deeper spiritual truth of who we are, what we are, where we are. And so when we experience the world as second order reality, we tend to project our inner stories onto the world and onto ourselves, believing them to be the objective reality. We perceive and construct our reality based on our karmic patterns, our experiences, beliefs, and interpretations, and we tend to mistake our own interpretation or our second order reality for the truth of our experience. And from this interpretation, you probably heard the term projection. So projection often arises from our tendency to believe our inner story and to project them onto the world, even when they don't necessarily match the present moment. So by bringing awareness to the process of perception, questioning the validity of our inner stories, and choosing to bring deeper awareness and curiosity to the first order reality, we discover greater peace and alignment with the present moment. And this process doesn't just happen with external people and objects, it also happens internally. So our interpretations of having a bad day, for instance, of failing a test, of making a mistake, or even more mundane things may also create an inner narrative about ourselves where we're judging ourselves, beating ourselves up, thinking we should have done it differently, or spinning over and over again about, I wish I had done this instead, and really just sort of stuck in the story and kind of feeling some suffering and pain from it. And so what happens when the inner story becomes self-judgmental and reinforces pain, painful, untrue ideas about ourselves, that if we are continually bringing these triggered stories, this sort of conditioned idea of all the flaws that we think we have, or that we think, we're stupid, or that we're, dumb, or that we made a mistake, or we really screwed up, or I messed up my life, or I did this thing, or I did whatever, and we continue to reinforce those stories, then that also is not helpful as part of the process. So the invitation here is to be aware of the process, to continue to return to the first order of reality of what I know to be true, because the actual experience underneath the story is the truth of the present moment, rather than the speculations or the projections of our interpretation. And so even when the mind does want to project or speculate, We want to have enough awareness to recognize it for what it is, that we can just recognize, like, okay, my mind is now telling me this story about this thing, this other person, or that I screwed up in whatever way, or, poor me, why did I do this to myself? But I can see the story happening instead of just believing that it's true, just, going along for the ride of the story and getting completely sucked into it. And so even when the mind wants to project, we can have enough awareness to recognize it for what it is and to bring more awareness back to the first order experience, to kind of drop below the story and just feel into what's true about the moment before that interpretation arises. And so what I am feeling in this moment, the feeling is real, but the interpretation and the story may be skewed, even if it's partially correct. It might not be necessarily in alignment with really supporting us in something that's deeper and more joyful, more truthful.